In biology, a spore is a unit of asexual reproduction that may be adapted for dispersal and for survival, often for extended periods of time, in unfavorable conditions. By contrast, gametes are units of sexual reproduction. Spores form part of the life cycles of many plants, algae, fungi and protozoa. Bacterial spores are not part of a sexual cycle but are resistant structures used for survival under unfavorable conditions. Myxozoan spores release amoebulae into their hosts for parasitic infection, but also reproduce within the hosts through the pairing of two nuclei within the plasmodium, which develops from the amoebula. Spores are usually haploid and unicellular and are produced by meiosis in the sporangime of a diploid sporophyte. Under favorable conditions, a spore can develop into a new organism using mitotic division, producing a multicellular gametophyte, which eventually goes on to produce gametes. Two gametes fuse to form a zygote which develops into a new sporophyte. This cycle is known as alternation of generations. The spores of seed plants, however, are produced internally and the megaspores, formed within the ovules and the microspores are involved in the formation of more complex structures that form the dispersal units. The seeds
and leaves. An individual fern leaf produces millions of spores, each a single, tiny haploid cell surrounded by a tough, resistant wall. The walls of each kind of fern spore are so distinctively sculptured that it is possible to tell the species from which it came. The spores of most species of ferns require light and moisture for germination. Light causes the spore to synthesize germanin. This substance triggers the germination process. First, a non-green root-like organ, the rhizoid, appears. Then a green shoot-like filament emerges from the spore. The rhizoid continues its existence as a single cell, but the green filament cell divides, forming a short chain of cells. Each mitotic division of these cells is so oriented that it adds to the length of the filament. When the filament is a few cells in length, the orientation of division alters so that the young plant begins to grow as a flat sheet, one cell layer in thickness. This sheet commonly assumes a heart-shaped form. The notch in the heart is the apical meristem, where cells are small and rapidly dividing. As cells are left behind by this meristem, they enlarge to many times their initial size by taking up water into their vacuoles and expanding the area of the cell walls.
Hello students, this is Non-Flowering Plants, and today we're going to go over the life cycle of a leptosporangiate fern. The leptosporangiate ferns are the most diverse group of plants that we call pteridophytes. Pteridophytes are plants that generally have this kind of life cycle. It's a life cycle in which we have a haploid stage that is a gametophyte, of course, and a diploid stage that then grows off of that gametophyte. So the gametophyte claims new ground, and the sporophyte becomes the dominant plant afterwards. We'll start with the egg and the sperm, and those are, of course, haploid. And then they get together at fertilization and form a zygote. That's the first diploid cell. That zygote divides and forms an embryo. That embryo forms a young sporophyte that is then growing off of the old gametophyte, and it'll kind of use up all of the energy of that old gametophyte. It keeps on growing and takes over the place where it's growing. The gametophyte's long gone, and that sporophyte will usually live on for years and years and make innumerable spores. Here's the morphology of a Plisticum. It has a rhizome, which is an underground stem, and then roots grow off of that rhizome, and leaves grow off of that rhizome. In Plisticum, the leaves are compound, so it has a main midrib called a rachis, and then off of that there are a series of pinnae. Each pinna looks like a leaf, but it's actually just part of a leaf. In other ferns, you could have it even more divided, and then the ultimate segments would be called pinnules. In Plisticum, if you look at the bottom of the leaf, then there's a series of little spots that are called sori. Each sorus then is a cluster of sporangia and associated structures. So here's a sorus, and then we have a blow-up of the sorus. We have a whole bunch of leptosporangia in this cluster, and an indusium, which in Plisticum is a shield-shaped structure. In different ferns, the indusium is shaped in all sorts of different ways, and that's useful for identifying them. If we look closely at one of these leptosporangia, we can see that in Plisticum and a great many other ferns, there's an annulus on one side, and that annulus consists of some cells that are very thick-walled in most sides, but they're thin-walled on another side. What that means is that as they dry, the water inside of them pulls back, and it makes the thin-walled places shrink, and it causes the thick-walled places to be under strain. At some point, that water column will break, and it'll then catapult the spores out. So here's some spores. Those spores, of course, were formed during meiosis from sporocytes. So the sporocytes were diploid, and we had meiosis, and it formed haploid spores. The spores disperse. That's still the stage that claims new ground in pteridophytes. And lucky spores will land in places that are suitable. Of course, many spores land in places that are not suitable. The spores that are lucky will then grow up to be gametophytes. And in some sense, the niche of the gametophyte determines where the fern can grow, at least partially. These gametophytes are heart-shaped or maybe kidney-shaped in many species. They could have both Antheridia and Archegonia. The usual situation is for the first spore that lands in a place, it'll mature first to be a female, and then it'll secrete pheromones out into the substrate called antheridiogens. That will stimulate other gametophytes to grow up to be male. If there are no other gametophytes, then that female gametophyte will eventually keep on growing and make antheridia itself, so it will be cosexual, but it's displaced in time. Okay, we can zoom in here and look closely at an antheridium, and of course it has jacket cells, and sperm are contained within, and an archegonium, which has neck cells and canal cells. The canal cells dissolve at maturity, allowing the sperm access to the egg at the base of the archegonium. So if we go back to the overall view again, the life cycle of pteridophytes is one in which the gametophyte grows from a spore that has claimed new ground. So the gametophyte is the initial stage of that spot on the earth. And then the sporophyte grows off of the gametophyte and becomes the dominant plant that lives longer and photosynthesizes more and is a major stage of the life cycle. And that's all that I have to say about that.